Good morning, Earth Science. I'm live to you from quarantine in my home office for the first of several video lectures for the remainder of the year. This particular one covers your Halite crystal project and also talks a lot about science writing. Um, Today marks the day that your Halite crystal project is due as far as the experiment part. It also marks the day we're going to push forward and making our presentations for this project. So I'm going to talk about that quite a lot today. It's going to be a long video. I hope that you fast forward, rewind, pause as needed. You certainly should be able to bounce back and forth throughout the project because I want you to be able to look at this video and have as much information as possible. You don't have to watch it all in one sitting. You can break it up if you need to. It's here for your help, okay? But you do need to watch it. So on your screen is a few dates. Today, obviously, your observations are due. And I always joke about this because every day, I mean, I've talked a lot about how important this project is, how many points it's worth. Every time this project's due, I have a bunch of students who realize, oh, wow, I forgot to start this project. And they often look like poor bubbles here in this animation, right? Your observations are due today. You're only going to have a week and a half to push forward on actually making your presentations. So we don't have much time to waste. Next week, probably the week afterwards as well, we'll be presenting your presentations to classmates. I'll have a form. You'll sign up for a time slot. You can present. I want you to present to about 5 or 6 other students. They can be of your choosing, though. So you can link up with your friends in any hour of Earth Science, decide what hour you want to present, and all of you can present during that time block. Okay. Now, before I move forward at all, I do want to talk a little bit about this document you're seeing on the screen. On Friday, I posted this a little early so you could have a chance to get to work on your presentations. Now, we started this halite crystal growing project a long time ago, more than a month ago, before we were quarantined. And so I told you several times that no matter what happens, this thing's going to be due, and it's going to be a huge part of your fourth quarter grade. It's nearly impossible to pass this fourth quarter unless you completed this project. And it's due now. So I'm hoping that you did complete it. Um, the presentation piece we haven't talked a lot about, other than that you would be presenting soon. So here's what that presentation is going to look like. This document describes the things you need in your presentation. It talks a little bit about the scientific method and scientific writing here. Um, I'll go into details about the presentation today, but I want you to know first and foremost, you have two options. There might be third options that I'll consider based on a student by student basis. I want you to present the results of your experiment either as a Google slideshow or as a poster. Both options will require you to get in front of a camera, either on your phone or on a web camera, and present your findings to classmates. You also have an option to call in. If you don't have access to internet, you can always call in to a Google Hangout using the provided phone number. And if we have a picture or something of your poster, you can just talk about it to us, okay? Now, as far as the grading is concerned, this document goes into some pretty insane detail about how I'm grading you. The experiment grade is due today. That's the part you already completed, the observations that you've been making. You get 5 points for completing that Google form proposal I sent to you a long time ago, where I wanted you to list your variables, your project idea, and you get the rest of the points from how well you actually conducted the experiment and whether you were taking good observations. Um, the other stuff, you'll notice that was 60 points. The report grade, which we're going to be talking about today, the bread and butter of this particular project, is 130 points, more than twice that amount. That's because this is the more important piece, the way that you communicate. And the reason I put this little graph about the scientific method here is you'll notice that last one, arguably the most important. It's not science if you don't communicate the results that you got. You have to be able to communicate your work. That's a critical part of the scientific method. And so the report grade here is worth so much because I'm trying to teach you how to communicate your results. Anyone can follow directions and make an experiment of some kind, especially growing salt. The important piece here is learning how to talk about it, learning how to present your findings in a way that scientists have been doing for hundreds of years. We're going to talk about that today. You also get these 30 points for your presentation grade, which I'm not going to talk a ton about right now. We'll come back to this document but I really want to focus on a few other things. So let's keep going. Um, First thing, if your salt crystal doesn't look like this image, it's fine. I've gotten a lot of emails worried about this. You know, my salt didn't grow on the string, it grew on the bottom, it grew on the sides, the rim of the jar. That's fine. If you have two different trials, two different jars, and the salt grows in a different spot on one compared to the other, that would be a good example of a qualitative measurement that you would want to include in your report, right? Um, Now, to that end, I do want to talk a little bit about the importance of science communication, not just writing, but also reading, right? To form a truly educated opinion about a scientific subject, you need to be able to analyze how scientific research is presented, right? Too many people rely on social media, YouTubers, and all kinds of second or third hand opinions about science. And then that informs their own understanding of the world around them, right? And every single one of you has fallen victim to this. I don't think a single one of you has ever actually read the original research report of a scientific article to make your own opinion, right? No, you hear science through a secondhand source like myself or another science teacher or your parents or the news or other people. Your understanding of science has always been shaped by other people's opinions. And that's a tough pill to swallow, but it's important for you to understand that. What I'm trying to give you now is the ability for you to look at the science itself. Um, no one can, unless you're conducting the science yourself firsthand, um, there's really no way that you can say to a degree of accuracy what's true and what's not, right? So when scientists conduct the research and they write a report, the whole point is that they're writing a recipe for you to do the exact same study yourself and get the same results. That's what a scientific research report is, right? So you have to be able to know how to read those. Have to know how to write those as well. It's the only way you can say without a doubt that you understand what you're talking about in any given moment, right? To really distinguish between a good and a bad interpretation of science, you have to be willing and able to read that primary literature yourself. So here's a funny meme. I've got another meme right after this. I think I used this when we talked about flat earthers. Obviously, a great example of people that get wrapped into other people's opinions they read on YouTube, and they only believe what they can see themselves, right? So that's why it's important for you to understand how to read these papers, right? So it says science isn't important after high school. 10 years later, that same person who didn't pay attention in science class and doesn't understand what science is yelling about the media lying to them and the earth actually being flat, right? It's important for you to know how to do science and what science is and also what it isn't, right? So right now, this is more important than ever. We're in the middle of COVID-19 coronavirus epidemic, and you have people that unfortunately claim to know a lot better than scientists the world over. You have people saying the media is trying to lie to us and this, that, and the other thing. And it's because these are people that don't really know the medical science behind epidemiology and everything going on with coronavirus. They don't know how antibodies work, how all of this stuff's happening. Um, and unfortunately, it carries a cost of lives right now. We have people dying because of decisions made at the highest level of government and at the low levels of government because people are not informed of this. And it's hard because it's new. So it's hard to be informed of something that even the scientific community doesn't know a ton about. But the important thing here is there's research out there, and you have to be able, again, willing and able to look at it yourself. Okay. So as far as science literacy is concerned, this is a skill. Reading a scientific paper takes practice. Writing a scientific paper takes practice. You need to be willing to do both, right? It's not just a skill for scientists or kids in college and that kind of thing, right? It's a skill every citizen needs to understand the world around them and to say with absolute objective truth what is real and what's not, right? So I'm going to show you an example of a scientific paper in a moment. The thing that I want you to keep in mind is it is very different from normal writing. You may love to read. You might like reading books, fiction or nonfiction, but reading a scientific paper is not the same thing. Writing a scientific paper is not the same thing as writing an essay for your English class. It's very different. So I have some tips for reading and writing a scientific paper. I'll just read the first ones here because that's going to be important right now. General tips for reading a scientific paper. Read the sections in a different order than they're presented. This will make more sense in a minute. So you don't necessarily read them from top to the bottom. Sometimes you need to skip around for very important reasons. When you're reading a scientific paper, you should take notes. They're lengthy. They're not designed to be super easy to read, okay? They can be kind of boring. You also need to read it multiple times for that same reason. You also need to be prepared to look up terms you do not understand. Scientific papers are all about accuracy and precision, which means they use really, really big words to describe very precisely what they're talking about. If you don't know those big words, if you don't have the most complete vocabulary, you have to be able to stop, pause, look up a term, and then keep reading, right? Sometimes context clues are not going to be enough to figure out what they mean, right? So I have some questions on the board. How does scientific writing differ from normal writing? What are the different parts of a scientific paper? What is important to include in each part? I want you to ask yourself these questions. All right, I'm going to show you a paper in just a moment. And I want you to pause this video if you can. Normally, if we were in class, I would have you do our circle, underline, star process to try to determine, the parts of this paper. Right now, I want you to go back to this question here. How does scientific writing differ from normal writing? And this part, what are the different parts of a scientific paper? Take a moment right now to pause this video. Try to guess. What are the parts of a paper? You probably guess there's a title. I'll give you that one. And an introduction. What else? I hope that you paused because right now I want to show you an example because I don't think you've probably guessed some of these. All right, so here's an example of a very famous research paper, one of the first ones I ever read in college. Definitely influenced my later research on wolves that I actually completed myself in college. So here's a big title. Right away, you should notice this is not like a title you'd write for English class. This one, in fact, it's not punctuated the same, it's not capitalized the same, it's long. This is all something you'll see in every scientific paper. Before the introduction, there's actually a section that maybe you've never heard of called the abstract, a critical piece of every scientific paper. The abstract is a summary in one paragraph of the entire paper. It's an important piece for every scientific journal. Scientists primarily, they don't make a lot of money, but they certainly, one of the ways that they get the research out there is they have to pay money to a journal to host their research, right? And so journals like this biological conservation journal here, they have to charge money. So they make money by charging people to read those journals, read these articles, right? So the abstract is usually the only piece of a scientific paper that's free. And this is why it's kind of developed as the main way to communicate what this study is about. Every study starts with a one paragraph abstract because it's partly the only thing that audiences can see for free. And then they decide, well, I want to buy this study because I want to know more, right? So an abstract is a one paragraph summary. We scroll down, we see an introduction section. I kind of gave that one away. You probably could have guessed that was there. There's a methods or a materials and methods section, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's a results section, which again might not be super surprising to you at this point. So I'm going to continue down the results. There is a discussion section as well. Some of you might have said conclusion. Discussion and conclusion are usually tied in with each other. At the very end, of course, we have our references, also known as a works cited or a bibliography section. So some of these parts should be a little familiar to you, right? So these are the parts listed on the screen. You have the abstract, intro, methods, results, discussion, and references. These are the pieces I'm looking for in your Halite crystal presentation. So again, the abstract is a complete but very succinct summary of your paper. The introduction gives background research and tells us your hypothesis. The methods section helps you explain how you performed the experiment and with what materials. The results section contains all the data you collected during the experiment. The discussion talks about how you think the data actually affected your variable, your hypothesis. So this is where you give an educated guess, and again, I want you to think claim, evidence, reasoning, where you talk about why your paper or why your project turned out the way it did. Finally, the references is the place where you cite all of your work. I will be expecting that. Okay, scientific paper is developed over the past 300 years as a tool to communicate science. And it's been mostly this format for that entire 300 years. The thing to keep in mind is the audience of the scientific paper is usually other scientists, people who are in a specialized field, who are very educated, and who know already what you're talking about. Your paper needs to emulate, or your presentation needs to emulate that as well. Your audience are your peers. They all did this project. They all have background knowledge, what halite is, what a chemical sedimentary rock is, or they should. So you have to assume that you're talking to fellow educated people when you write this paper. Again, this is why reading these papers is often very tough because they're written for people who are very educated. And maybe if you are not, or if you haven't had the training to read a paper, a lot of it sounds like gibberish, right? When you saw that paper I showed you, there's a lot of, it's big, it's long, there's a lot of weird words in there. You need to be able to pick through some of that stuff, okay? So there's kind of two purposes for a paper. One is to present information in a way that's easy to retrieve, and the other is that you need to present enough information for somebody to duplicate the scientific study. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through each of these components in the paper. I'm going to write about, or I'm going to talk about how scientists usually go about writing these pieces of their papers, and I'm going to talk about what your halite project should probably look like as well. Let's start with the title, okay? The title needs to be specific enough to summarize the entire experiment study's focus. So an example of a bad title would be Halite Crystal Project. Not a good title. Doesn't tell me what you tested. It doesn't tell me anything about it. All it tells me is that you're doing something about halite. It's not a good scientific title. Because the title needs to describe the variable being tested or measured. This is an important piece. You need to be able to talk about the variable that you change, your experimental variable. And you need to be able to talk about how it affects the variable that you're measuring, your dependent variable, in this case, your crystal growth, either the speed or the size, right? Another weird thing that's different compared to other English projects, most projects outside science, your title would be every letter or every word would be capitalized. Not the case for a scientific paper. Only proper nouns like names, locations, and the first letter of the title should be capitalized. So there's some examples here. So renal disease susceptibility and hypertension are under an independent genetic control in the fawn-hooded rat. That's a mouthful, right? But that's what a scientific title should be. This particular title describes how renal disease and hypertension link to certain genetic factors in a specific species, right? It lists very specifically the variables tested and the variables measured. Territory size in Lincoln sparrows is another example. They give the scientific name of the Lincoln sparrow, and they show that they're talking about, they're looking to study what size their territory for this particular organism is, right? So the title you should probably write last. The abstract you should also probably write at the very end of your project. The abstract, again, is a one paragraph summary of your article, 50 to 100 words, okay? I do want you to write the abstract as a paragraph, even though the rest of your presentation, I don't want that, okay? So I already talked about kind of some of this stuff here. As far as writing your abstract, the best way to do that is start by writing one or two sentences to summarize each section. The introductory section, or the introductory sentence, then have a sentence about your research question and your hypothesis, then a sentence about data collection, how you collected data, and then maybe a few sentences about your results and observations, and then a couple sentences for your conclusion. If you have written the rest of your paper and you go down the line there You can put all that, summarize each bit into one sentence, and then stick that together in your abstract. It is so important that you write this last, okay? So here's an example of an abstract. I'm not going to make you read it. I'm not going to read it. But I do want to do one thing really quickly. So I'm going to pull up a document that I highly encourage you all make. So if you're ever writing a paper for any project, you should always start with an outline. And an outline just tells you what are the things that I'm going to write, right? So I'm going to fill in this outline as we're talking right now. I've already kind of prepared it, so I'm just going to copy and paste some stuff into this outline. And so I just talked about your abstract. I said you needed an introductory section, a research question, data collection, blah, blah, blah. So I'm actually going to write those things I just talked about in as bullet points on my outline here, right? So if I were to use this outline, I would try to say, halite, crystal growth, blah, 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 blah. I would try to fill in each of these points that I've written in here as a full sentence. So I'd write a sentence here that is my introductory sentence. I'd write a sentence here that's my research question. I'd write a sentence that's all about data collection, when I did it and how often. And then at the end, after I filled out this outline, I'll be able to go back and copy and paste each of these sentences directly into my slideshow or my poster, right? So an outline is just going to be a way that I can organize my ideas as I'm doing this project. And so I'll keep referencing this outline as we go forward. All right, as far as the intro, this is where you give background information about your study. That's no surprise, right? It's also where you present your question and your hypothesis. You need to reference, your experimental variables, but primarily you need to start very broad and try to narrow your focus. So start by talking about what is halite, what is salt, and by the end of your intro, you should be talking about what you specifically are going to test, right? So here's your writing tips. Open with a few sentences placing your study in context. So what is halite? What is rock salt? How does it form? Okay, you should all know halite is a chemical sedimentary rock. Just from our classroom, you should know that it's an evaporite, which means that it forms when water containing solutions evaporates off and leaves the salt crystals behind as a pure mineral, right? Those are the things that you'd want to start off by talking about. Then you need to talk, the next thing you'd have in your intro is the problem and its history, including previous research. So it's probably going to be helpful for you to look for what are the kinds of things that would affect how an evaporate forms. You can find this all over the web. Use any resource you want. The only thing is you have to make sure to include it as a citation at the end, right? The next thing, describe how your work contributes to scientific knowledge. So usually in a research paper, the question is, why did I do this project? Now you did this project because I told you to. So that's not really what I'm looking for here. What I'm looking for is what is your experimental variable? Why did you choose that one? So if you just talk to me about what kind of variables might affect how well an evaporite crystal grows, which of those things did you pick? And maybe you didn't think about why when you picked it, and that's fine. But try to justify it now that you've done some research. If you changed, for example, the temperature of where your crystals grew, how might that have affected the crystal growth? Why was that a good variable to pick in your mind, right? Finally, you need to state the information that your article is addressing. So what is your hypothesis? That's the last part of your introduction. It should be the last part of your introduction. So here are some examples. This is the first thing I said was open with a few sentences, placing your study in context. These examples are all dealing with a specific kind of rat. So talk about the subject. In our case, it's going to be halite. The next one, describe the problem. In this case, they're saying there's only been a few studies, which is why this researcher is talking about these rats. Which also bleeds into this part where it says, describe how your work contributes to scientific knowledge, and then state the information your article addresses. So on the end here is where you want to put in like your hypothesis, right? So going back to our outline, let me switch over here real quick. have a few lines that I would recommend you tried to answer in your own outline, okay? Now, obviously, your presentation shouldn't have these words at all in the presentation itself, but the questions or the sentences that you're responding, those would be the pieces you'd want to stick together. So, description of halite rock salt. Halite is a chemical sedimentary blah 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 blah, right? So you'd type in your sentence and then you'd copy that into your presentation, right? So my guide for you, if you're trying to figure out in what order do you want to write your presentation, describe what halite rock salt is, talk about the different kinds of salt and what each of them might be used for. Talk about the properties of salt as a mineral. We've talked a little bit about that. You have an ESRT that might give you some help. Of course, you need to cite it if you use it. Describe how evaporites like halite actually form in nature. Talk about the factors that might affect how they form. Describe that variable you decided to test. And then finally, give me your hypothesis statement. And I gave you an example here that you can just fill in the blanks if you want. It is likely that blank will increase the growth rate of halite crystal. So it's likely that temperature, or it's likely that the substrate, the string type you use, whatever. You're going to want to end your introduction with that hypothesis statement. Okay. Now, notice I say it is likely and not I think that this is going to happen. Scientific papers, I'll talk about this in a minute, they really don't care about what you think. And I don't mean that to be mean. Scientific papers are all about what we can measure as truth. And so your opinions, your thoughts do not matter in a scientific paper. You only talk about statistics and facts, right? So you don't say, I think that this is going to do this, or I thought this, or I believed this. You say, it is likely, and you talk about why you think it's likely. Okay? So back to our presentation. Let's move on to methods. The methods section is where you describe how you performed your study and what materials you used. You need to have enough information in the methods section for somebody to go back and completely redo your project from scratch. That's an important piece here. The methods is like a recipe in a cookbook. You have to list all the things you used, all the materials. You have to describe exactly how you used them in enough detail that someone could go out, buy the same things, conduct the same experiment, and more importantly, they should be, if your experiment's good, they should be able to get the exact same results you did. So, as far as tips, write this section chronologically. Again, think about it like a recipe. In what order did things happen? So, you could talk about this in a few different ways. There are kind of 3 things you have to include in your methods section that might make you think about what order you put them in. So, those things that you need to list the materials you use. I'm okay if you just put these as a bulleted list. Maybe if you're doing a slideshow, you had one slide that just lists all the materials you had. Boom, done. Perfect. The next one says study design. How did you plan to test your variable? How many trials did you use? How did you control variables? Where did you place your jar? These are all important things you need to describe. So the study design is the big part of the methods. You need to say how you actually conducted your study. How did you set it up? How did you make sure that only one variable was changed between them? How did you make sure the other stuff was identical, right? So that's a big piece of this. You have to list that information. How did you conduct the study? Finally, you have to talk about what you measured and how you measured it. So the data collection details. What kind of data did you collect? How was it measured? You were asked to make quantitative and qualitative measurements. So you need to list them here and describe how you actually measured them. So say your quantitative measurement was the length of your particular crystal growth, right? That's fine. You still need to talk about how you measured that. Did you use a ruler? It's up to you, right? So I'm going to copy in my my methods section now on this outline. So here we have our materials list you need for sure. Then you need your step-by-step instructions, which I've highlighted here. You need to describe your observations when you did them, and what you measured. Now, here's another thing. Say your materials list. You just made a table, a list. Um, that's fine. On your next slide, you could just copy and paste that observation table I gave you. Instead of, you know, talking about, well, I observed them this date, this date, this date, I measured this, this, and this, you could just copy and paste your observation data directly into your slideshow and call it done, as long as it meets all these other things, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I want to save you some time here, okay? Here's some examples of different methods sections, one that's focusing on the materials used, one that focuses on how the study was designed, and one that focused on how they actually collected data. Okay, we're getting to the end. The results section. This presents the facts that you actually get in an investigation. It includes the data, so all the measurements that you took, and these are often displayed in tables, pictures, figures, or graphs. You're required to take 6 pictures for your project. The results section would be where you put them. Now, I don't want them all necessarily on one slide in the slideshow. You can put a couple pictures on one slide, then another slide, then another. That's fine. Okay. The important part here is you need to have at least a table or a figure of some kind, a graph of some kind, right? You should have some written text that describes the importance of those things, but you definitely need at least one sort of table or graph here. So, for example, if you're trying to show off all your measurements and things like that, this is where you would paste that in. So those observations, when you actually made those measurements, this is where you'd want to put them. You can also create a graph very easily with your quantitative measurements. So for example, let's say you measured crystal growth length, we will say length or mass of some kind. You could have a bar graph where one bar is your first jar and another bar is your second. Maybe you had more, you could add those. That'd be one way to do that. Another example is if you made a line graph where time would be your independent variable and crystal growth would be your dependent variable. You can show how one jar, maybe the growth on every date that you measured it went up or down, right? The important thing for the results is that you don't have a ton of written text. For every table or graph that you have, you should maybe have a sentence describing what it is, okay? Here's some example of results. We don't have to read through this whole thing. The one thing I do want to point out, though, is look at this second example where it says Figure 2B, Figure 2A. All of the pictures and tables and graphs that you have in the results should be labeled. So make sure that you have them labeled and that when you talk about them, you refer to those labels in parentheses here, okay? All right, going back to our outline real quick as far as what I would want to put into the results. Right away, you want to make sure that you're putting some tables. You want pictures. You want to describe what happened in each of your trials, each of your jars, and you want to describe the similarities and differences between them. Now, remember here, guys, you are not talking about why they are important. You're just telling us, what did you see? Okay, so don't talk about your hypothesis here. Do not talk about why any of this is important. You're only talking about the actual data you measured and any relationships you might have found between them. Okay, we're in the last real section now, the discussion. This is where all that claim evidence reasoning practice we've had in class is really going to come into play, because the discussion is all about making evidence-based conclusions about what your results show. You should be able to explain the relationship between your experimental and your dependent variable here. Just a reminder, your dependent variable is crystal growth. Your experimental variable was up to you. So how did temperature or whatever affect crystal growth? Okay, your claims need to be backed up by evidence from your experiment, but you can also, I want you to make sure that you understand, you can make educated guess about why things happen the way they did. It may not be clear to you why maybe both your jars were the exact same no matter what, But you should be using your online resources or some other resource to say why that might have happened, and make sure you point to that resource as evidence for your statement. Okay. Um, the discussion is also where you finally assess whether your hypothesis was supported or disproven. Don't you dare say your hypothesis proves anything. 'Cause remember, science does not prove things. Yeah, science is about finding testable hypotheses that are falsifiable, right? You can disprove a hypothesis, you can't prove it right. So you need to be able to say, was my hypothesis maybe supported or was it disproven? Or there's a third option here, one that I think most of you would probably qualify for. Maybe I can't say anything at all about my hypothesis because of some error in the way that I designed my experiment. And I don't mean that like you made a mistake, but I mean that more as in um, the experiment that we did, there's no way that it really accurately says much about our hypothesis, truly. Any scientist would look at the experiments we did and they laugh for a couple of reasons. So at the bottom here it says, and I'll explain why, it says address possible errors, complications in your work, and suggest a way that you could better test your hypothesis and give it another chance. Well, here's why. So see these red things? It says when addressing the strength of your experiment, think about the things that could affect how strongly you can make an argument for. Were there enough trials to make an accurate claim? And again, if you're watching this, this would be a key for me to know whether you watch this video. Look, none of us did enough trials to make an accurate claim about our hypothesis. 2 trials is not enough. If I want to be absolutely sure that my hypothesis was supported or disproven, I would be doing hundreds of trials to see if the same thing happens in every one of them, right? It says were all control variables accounted for besides our experimental variable. Were they? I obviously I challenge you to do that, but it would be very difficult, right? Obviously, they're not sitting in the exact same location under the exact same temperature requirements. One might have just a slightly more sunlight than the other. There's all kinds of things that could be different between them. Obviously, science is all about trying to reduce those other variables, but it's really hard to do that from home, right? Finally, what assumptions were made? I'll leave that one up to you. Certainly, there could be some assumptions made one way or the other. So, as far as writing the discussion, make a list of all the ideas you'll discuss and try to work out what comes first, what comes next, and what comes up last. Because this is the end of your paper, this is also where you want to leave off with a very strong conclusion statement. So, again, for this outline, I've kind of put a few things here which I'll paste into our outline, and I'll maybe just put the discussion on another page here so it's a little easier to see. So if you're writing the discussion, you're going to want to write sentences that answer these things before you start piecing it together. First, write a sentence that summarizes the results. What was the difference between the trials? Next, write a sentence that describes how your experimental variable, whatever it may be, affected the crystal growth. Answer this question. Was the change significant? Was there a lot of difference between your 2 jars or not so much? Next, explain why you believe the experimental variable affected crystal growth the way it did. Why do you think, if you did see some change, why do you think your variable maybe promoted growth or limited growth in the one jar and not the other? So these next parts are about assessing whether you made strong arguments. Were my results significant enough to support or disprove my hypothesis? So did I see enough change to say much about my hypothesis? And did I design my experiment well enough to say much about our hypothesis? And again, I will contend that none of us were able to design an experiment well enough to support or disprove our hypothesis. We just couldn't, because again, that would require a lab, that would require hundreds of different tests. We didn't do that, right? You also need to list other reasons that the crystal might have grown the way it did. It's not necessarily just because of your variables. There could be other reasons, including random chance. Um, Describe the ways your experiment could be improved if you had better resources, and then leave off with the conclusion statement. If you do all of those things, you should be almost done at this point. Um, Again, I would recommend you write the start with your results. You already have your data written up. Methods would be an easy thing to start working on as well. Save your introduction and your discussion for the middle part of this presentation, and then wrap up with your abstract and title. Do these things last, okay? Even though they're the beginning of your project, save those things for last, okay? Now, um, the references we still have to talk about. I'm not going to be really particular about this for a couple reasons. One, you probably know references better as a works cited page or bibliography, where you put it at the end to describe all of the different resources you had, right? This is difficult for a couple reasons. You've been learning MLA format in English class. In Freshman Connect, we're about to start talking about some of this stuff, so expect that coming up. Um, Science generally uses APA format, though, not MLA. Now, you will have a chance to use either that you're comfortable with here. I'll give you a choice. I promise I'm probably not going to mark a bunch of points down for what format you use, okay? So MLA, there's some differences here, and I want to talk about the differences. You've been using MLA, 12-point font, that kind of thing. If I am referring to a particular resource in my slide or in a paper, I'm going to usually put it in parentheses with this author page number format. So if in my report I said, Mr. Williams might be the coolest teacher ever, I'm going to, in parentheses, write the name of the person I got that information from, and then the page number of whatever publication they came from. Now, I'll put that in the middle of my paper, and then at the end of the paper in the works cited, that's where I will have the full information, right? So at the bottom here, author's last name, first name, source name, publication date, right? The thing to keep in mind also in MLA format, your works cited section has all your citations listed alphabetically, so by that last name, right? APA is different. The reference section of an APA lists everything in chronological order, in the order they appear in your report. So if you refer to something in your intro first, that'll be the first thing that shows up in your references page. APA also uses a different format for referencing things in text. So again, if in my slideshow I had Mr. Williams, the best teacher in America right now, no kidding, in parentheses, I'd put the last name, comma, the date that that information came from, okay? At the end, in the references section, you would use a slightly different format here, where you have the author's last name and then the first initial. You don't have the first name at all. Then you have the date, the source name, the publication. So here's some examples. This is the same reference being shown in two different ways, right? So the first, you have the MLA, and the second, you have the APA format, okay? Almost done, I swear. We have one last thing to talk about. Talked about the tips for reading a paper. Here's the most important part about scientific voice in writing a paper. Scientific writing uses very, very different writing conventions. In some ways, it's very different from what you'd write in an English class for a number of reasons, and it's not just format. Scientists do not use contractions like don't, won't, can't, shouldn't. They use the full words, okay? So if any of your words require an apostrophe, you should probably spell the whole thing out. So instead of don't, say do not. Shouldn't, should not, okay? Ain't, you shouldn't use the word ain't. So make sure that you try to limit that, okay? The sentences should also be very short. They should not be run-on sentences. You shouldn't use and, but, a lot of those, right? They should be very short, very direct. In some ways, it's a lot simpler to write this way. You just write what happened, and that's it. One thing that a lot of people get wrong, and this is actually kind of debated a lot in the scientific world, use an active voice, not a passive voice. And I know you probably don't know what that means, but here's an example. Say that you did something, not that something happened. We found that, instead of it was found or it was determined that. Talk about yourself. Science is done by scientists. In this case, you're the scientist. It's okay to refer back to yourself. Finally, I already mentioned this one, never talk about your opinions or beliefs. So the hypothesis, right, it is likely instead of I believe. Okay? Now, that kind of wraps up where we were going for our slideshow here. So I'm going to wrap things up really quickly. I just have a couple things I want to show you. First, I want to talk about the requirements in this paper, and then I'm going to show you some examples, and then I'll stop talking, and you're free to get working on this project, okay? So you'll notice the title, abstract, intro, methods, results, discussion, and references all have specific things that I'm grading you for certain points. So I'm looking for a correctly titled, formatted title. I need it long and specific enough, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of the stuff I just mentioned in this video, all of these things has to be in each section for you to get proper points. I'll just draw your attention. I'll give you a chance to read that on your own. I'll draw your attention to the bottom here, some specific requirements. So again, I want you writing in a scientific voice. Okay, I'm looking to see that you're not writing long, flowery descriptions. Your sentences are short, sweet, to the point. You're not using contractions or compound sentences. I'm obviously looking for grammar and spelling. That's no surprise. I'm also looking for the required photos and diagrams. I want at least 6 photos, and I need at least one other photo or diagram to show your setup and for everything that you did, okay? Presentation grade, I can, I guess, talk about that relatively briefly. When you grade each other, your peer grading, these are the things you're going to grade each other on. Presentation structure, content accuracy, knowledge gained, attractiveness, and presentation skills, okay? Let's really quickly run through some examples from last year. The first one, I just realized that I think I used examples from siblings of our current honors kids. Let's use this one first. This is done by Allie Barker last year. And their project was a little different. They actually were expected to write things out as if it were an essay. And they were also, they didn't have much guidelines in the way of sourcing some information. So look at her title first. Crystal Ice, How Epsom Salt Transforms into a Mass of Clear Elongated Crystals. This is a title I probably wouldn't like, and I think I marked her down, if only because it doesn't describe the variable that was changed. So Epsom salt, I already know she was growing Epsom salt. I don't know what she changed to affect how they grew. She gave me a 1-paragraph abstract talking about magnesium sulfate, primarily describes her experiment. The introduction here starts by talking about halite, moves on to how halite grows, and then ends with her big problem and hypothesis, which she put on a separate slide here. So she really emphasized the fact that the hypothesis here is that halite crystal might be made of magnesium sulfate instead of iodized sodium chloride. It might be more transparent. That's a great hypothesis. I'm good with that. So for the methods section, this is the recipe part where she describes what exactly she did, and also describes the materials she used. She uses pictures to show the experimental setup, which is a good use of pictures. The results include a table that describes the quantitative and qualitative measurements that were made. Has some pictures that shows the salt as it developed. Obviously hers kind of came out on that string pretty well. And then in the discussion, she talks about ways that she could improve her experiment. I have one other example, probably the best from last year, not that I'm comparing. This one's from Maya Musgrave. She gives, well, for one, the presentation looks pretty good. She gives a paragraph for the abstract. Again, introduction talks about how chemical sedimentary rocks and evaporites form, and then narrows that focus down towards what her experiment was actually about. And again, I want to be clear, these guys had a different presentation structure than you did. You do not need to type all this stuff up in a paragraph. Bullet points are fine. I prefer those, short and sweet, okay? You don't need to write all of this stuff. So here's her hypothesis and problem. She goes into methods where she talks about what she did, the different kinds of salt she used, had results here. So again, these tables look really great. You learned how to do those in Freshman Connect. I hope that you can use those here. She also had a variety of pictures showing off the differences in the salt development. Had some really cool salts develop here. She had 3 different slides for the discussion. Again, you don't need to write them out all the way, but she describes all this stuff really well. And then she's got a final page for literature cited. All right. So that about wraps it up at this point. It's been a particularly long video, so I'm sorry for that. But hopefully it has enough information that you can get started on this presentation. I highly, highly recommend that you use this info as best you can. And if you've made it this far, I will give you a slight reward. That outline document that I made during this video, if you email me, I will give you that document and all the questions and stuff I put on it. And all you have to do is just answer them and copy them into your presentation. So that's my little Easter egg for reward for making it through this long. So again, if you email me asking me for that outline, I'll send it to you. Otherwise, I hope this is enough to get started. So I'll stop yapping now. Thank you for tuning in. I surely appreciate it. I hope you have a good week making those presentations. Feel free to contact me at any time with questions. All right. Good luck.